talk for half an hour or so. I'm not sure if I could go much more beyond that. So basically, we've been reading about the Hakamas HaMishkan, and every time we discuss Mishkan, we culminate the discussion about the laws of Shabbos. This happens twice. When Hashem speaks to Moshe in Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh, where he talks about the Mishkan and the Big Day Kahuna, and then it ends with the paragraph, V'shamru v'nei Yisrael es HaShabbos, that the Jewish people should keep Shabbos. That's when Hashem speaks to Moshe. And then,
Is that on Shabbat? That's what we say on Shabbat?
That is exactly what you say, yeah. Many people say it, the Kiddush of Shabbos morning, and many people say it in Arvit, before the Amida. Here in Ohr Somayach, as you note, we actually do not say that. If you look at, if you just follow the davening here, and that's because under the Shita of the Vilna Gaon, you don't want to have any extra interruptions between Ma'ariv and Shemona Esrei. But you are correct. In most synagogues, they will in fact say B'Shamru. Yeah.
It's a din in the Vilna Gaon. It's not like Eretz versus America.
No, it's based on the Vilna Gaon. I mean, the minhag of the Ashkenazi Kehilos of Eretz Yisrael are based on the Shitas of the Vilna Gaon. So that's why. Well, those who follow the Vilna Gaon in America will not say it either. But most do not follow those minhagim of the Gra. Excuse me a second. Can you get me a tissue or something? Just, yeah. Yeah, thank you. So Rashi explains that the idea is that even though there's a mitzvah to build a Mishkan, you don't do it on Shabbos. Shabbos is more important than Mishkan. And indeed, the whole origin of the 39 activities of work that you do not do on Shabbos are based on the activities that were involved in the construction of the Mishkan. Every one of the 39 malachos has to be matched to something that was done in the construction of the Mishkan. Now, some of the connections may not be obvious. Let's take cooking. What cooking was done in the construction of the Mishkan? The answer is they had to cook various herbs to extract the dye by which they would color the curtains and the wall hangings. You see? So that's enough to give it a connection. Writing. When they would match up the boards, they would take the Mishkan apart, but they would want the boards to be in the same sequence. So they would write Aleph, Aleph, Beis, Beis. So the two boards would be put in the same positions. Carrying, of course. So every malacha is defined by what was done in the Mishkan. And Shabbos has priority over Mishkan and over Beis HaMikdash for that matter. So what's interesting is that one of the ideas here is that there are two types of holiness that exist in the world. There is the holiness of space and the holiness of time. And Judaism recognizes both ideas of holiness. Holiness of space. Now, God is everywhere, right? One might even say, why is it better to be in Eretz Yisrael than Chutz La'aretz? Why is it better to be in Jerusalem rather than the rest of Eretz Yisrael? Why is it better to be in the Beis HaMikdash? Isn't Hashem everywhere? And if Hashem is everywhere, then Hashem is in Montana and North Dakota, exactly the same way he is at the Kaisel HaMaravi. And yet, Judaism recognizes there's a notion of holiness of place. So the way to understand holiness of place, which seems to be a contradiction to the omnipresence of the Almighty, that God is everywhere, is that God may be everywhere, but our capacity for reception may depend. Like, imagine like a cell phone, right? You have dead zones. There are certain zones that don't have good reception. So yeah, Hashem is in Montana, but it might be harder for my neshama to pick up the vibes than it is in Jerusalem, right? So holiness of place is not a function of Hashem being more in one place than another place. It's more of a function of my capacity to receive his presence, which may be stronger in certain places. In other words, to put it another way, God is more accessible. God is more reachable in certain designated places. Now, this itself raises an interesting quandary that people sometimes have. On one hand, Judaism recognizes holiness of place. But holiness of place has a little bit of a downside. And the downside is, when your Judaism is bound up too much to where you are, then you can fall into a trap that if you're not in that ideal location, what's the point? So an example might be, if Judaism is based on like full-time Torah learning in a yeshiva, so what's going to be when I'm not in yeshiva and I'm in college and I'm working and I'm not learning that much? I might as well figure, what's the use? Whatever I do is not worth anything. So side by side with holiness of place, a person has to also know that God is accessible everywhere. Meaning both ideas are true at the same time. There are special places, but God is reachable even not in special places. And therefore, when you're working, when you're in college, when you're in college campuses, whatever it is, Hashem could be found there as well. This is what the Chafetz Chaim says. When Moshe is standing at the burning bush, the very first time that God speaks to him. And remember, the burning bush is at Mount Sinai. It's not in Eretz Yisrael. So God says, take off your shoes, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Right? Remember that pasuk. The place where you are standing is holy ground. The Chafetz Chaim says, those words of the Torah are not just addressed to Moshe. They are addressed to us. The place where you are is holy. Now that doesn't just mean a location. It also means generally. A person might say, oh, if only I had a different family, if only I had a different set of talents, if only I had a different environment, a different job, a different yeshiva, then I could serve Hashem properly. But the answer is no. Where you are and who you are is how you serve Hashem. So we do recognize some places are better than others on one level. On the other level, God is everywhere. And therefore, wherever I am is holy ground, because God is reachable in all of those places. In fact, in a way, you see this in the idea of the Mishkan itself. The Mishkan, of course, is the prototype for the Beis HaMikdash. But there is a real difference. The Beis HaMikdash is a fixed location. There's only one place where there's a Beis HaMikdash. That's Yerushalayim, right? A mile down the road here. The Mishkan is a holy place, but it doesn't have a fixed location. The Mishkan travels from place to place. So side by side with the holiness of space, there's a recognition of the portability of Kedusha. And this has really many, many, many implications. Sometimes, you come to a place like Yerushalayim, a very intense place, and a person may come with a limited background, and they're invited for Shabbos to I'm going to just make up something, to a 10th generation Yerushalmi home. And one might feel, the 6-year-old kid knows more Mishnah, knows more Gemara than I know. And a person, could sometimes feel a little inferior. A person might feel, how can I ever catch up? I can never catch up to them. On a good day, in fact, I feel this way sometimes with my Hebrew speaking. On a good day, I speak as good as a 7th grader. And I'm proud of that when I can do that good. 7th grader. Listen, I'm a college graduate. Why should I be proud of speaking like a 7th grader? So we look at the world around us, and we look at people like Rav Chaim Kanevsky and Rabbi Yashiv, people who know the whole Talmud by heart. And you can get a real inferiority complex. It is interesting that even if you're a beginner in Ohr Somayach, I'm going to give you a statistic that's pretty amazing. You know more about Judaism than 85% of the Jews in the world. You are the 85th percentile. I mean, you like to own him. That's how, right? So, it's a good thought. You are like among the most learned people in the Jewish world. Okay?
Is it a good thought?
Well, it's kind of a fantastical thought, but it actually is accurate. In fact, there are all sorts of stories. I don't remember the whole detail of the story about a guy who was mamish in Oretz, but he happened to be more learned than anyone else in the shul, so he became the Rav of the shul, and he just made up rules and everything else because he was the most learned guy there. And then one day a real rabbi came and kind of they discovered they were doing everything wrong. But okay. But so when you're living in that ignorant environment, so you think, I know how to daven, I know how to put on tefillin, I'm a pretty good Jew. But then you come here, and even if you're a rabbi, you come here, gee, now you see you're kind of a nobody, right? And it could sometimes hurt a person a little bit, because a person wants to feel that they're worthwhile, they can make a contribution. But here's the thing, here's the interesting secret that you need to know. It is true that the fifth generation Mei Asharim person has things that we will never have. You're right. They have head starts, they have certain advantages, they have a certain acculturation, they have a certain learning. I'm not going to catch up with them. But it's also true that the guy who comes from South Dakota has something that the Mei Asharim person doesn't have either. It's not like, there's only one definition of closeness to God, and I'm either connected to that or less connected to that. Rather, there are many, many pathways. Because look at it this way. If God put you in a certain environment over which you had no control, you made no decisions, you did not decide when and where you were going to be born. You did not decide, certainly as a child, the experience you would go through. But God put you through those experiences. And if that's the case, God is essentially declaring that the perfection and realization of your neshama requires that you be in that environment, that you be in Montana, you be in South Dakota. And there is something you take from that environment that will be the foundation of who you are. Do you see the point? The point I'm making is that we sometimes think that tshuva means I amputate my past. I cut off my past. I disregard my past because I got to become a new person. But in a way, that's counterproductive. Because if your tshuva involves cutting off your past, then that means all of those years were dead time. All of those years were wasted. So it's like telling a person when he's 25 or 30, okay, listen, you wasted the first 30 years, okay, but you can make the next, 50 years count. Well, that's good, but it's still pretty bad to say, the 30 years, just write them off. But there's a different concept here. Instead of writing off those 30 years, ask yourself the question, what have I learned from those experiences that will give me my special relationship to God? Not by escaping what I was, but by looking at what I was and extracting the good from it. If somebody was a drug addict for 20 years and they kick the habit, one way of looking at it is they just repudiate that part of their life and move forward, which is good. Of course it's good, but that does mean those 20 years are just dead time. The other way is they use the experiences of being addicted as a basis of understanding of how they help people. They become a rehabilitation counselor or the like. Now, the difference between the two is, one is a tshuva that we might call amputation, and the other is a tshuva that we call transformation, reclamation. I've said this many times, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, who died a few years ago, had quite an amazing story. He suffered from multiple sclerosis for many years, and he continued to teach and raise money and really make Mir into a gigantic Makam Torah. But by now, everybody knows his famous story. He grew up in an Orthodox home, but it was more of a modern home. And he went to a co-ed high school in Chicago, Jewish high school, co-ed. He was on the debating team. He played basketball. And it happened to be his great uncle was the previous Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, so he had a yichus. So he used to say that when he came to Israel, like after high school graduation to learn, so his uncle, his great uncle, set him up with chavrusas, and he had never learned for 4 hours at one time. He had learned Gemara 45 minutes a day or whatever it would be. So they're learning 4 hours, morning Seder. And he is so exhausted, he cannot go on another minute. So he asked his chavrusa, so what do you guys do in the afternoon around here? You have this hard learning session in the morning. In the afternoon, you have like tiyulim, or you go out. And when the person said, well, we do the same thing again. He says he went crazy. He couldn't understand it at all. Now, when he died, and there were many, many eulogies that were given about him, one of the points that people kept on making over and over and over again was, you see how no matter how bad your environment was, you can escape it, you can transcend it. Here was a man who went to a co-ed high school, and he was talking to girls and playing basketball. All of that tuma, all of that real evil stuff. And he was able to reject it and rise above it. So you're never, so to speak, beyond hope. In other words, the emphasis was how destructive his environment was, but he had the koach to rise above it. And people are nodding, that's kind of what they want to hear. Yes, you can rise above, even if you come from the flesh pots of America. You can become a righteous person. But I have to admit, as I'm hearing this over and over again, I was a little uneasy with it. And the reason I was uneasy with it was I myself had a background that was somewhat similar. I went to in Hartford, Connecticut, I was zocher to go to an Orthodox day school. Number one, it was co-ed. Number two, most of my classmates were not Shomer Shabbos, because in those days, the Salman Schechter conservative day school movement didn't start yet. So if you were a Jewish parent, whether it was conservative, reform, or Orthodox, and you wanted your child to have at least a half-day Jewish education, you had to go to the Orthodox school. That was the only show in town. Now that's no longer the case. But as a result, I grew up with people who were not keeping Shabbos. That was my group with girls. And I tell you, even right now, I only have the fondest memories of those experiences. I think they were wonderful. It was a wonderful school, wonderful teachers. Influences that still help me a lot. So I'm kind of offended when I'm hearing how bad, that environment was. In truth, Rabbi Finkel is greater than the eulogy said. The eulogies lauded him for escaping his environment. But the truth is, he never really escaped his environment. He drew on that environment to help people in many, many ways. Those who knew the Rosh Yeshiva know that one of his great talents was he was able to talk to all sorts of American kids from different backgrounds. So if you were a kid from a modern Orthodox high school or even a public school, and you would come to Israel, and you would see the Mir Yeshiva, it was kind of on the itinerary, a big yeshiva, and then you would see the Rosh Yeshiva, and it's very scary, a man with a long beard in a black kapata. And it was also a little scary because of his MS, he didn't speak very clearly, so it was hard to fully understand him. And you're looking at a guy that has nothing to do with your reality. It's like the Twilight Zone. And then he starts talking about basketball, foul shots, debating team, all sorts of things that these kids were familiar with. And it kind of blew their mind. And what he was communicating was, you can have all of that in your background. And you can still grow into a Talmid Chacham, to learn. In other words, I know another Rosh I don't want to get into that guy, I'm not going to get into the name at all. But I know another Rosh Yeshiva who actually came from a modern background. But for various reasons, he decided he had to kind of cover that up. That's no longer part of who he is. He's part of the Haredi establishment. I get calls sometimes from his sister, who complains that their whole family heritage is being hijacked and redefined, etc. So that would be an example of someone who feels, and again, I'm not impugning because I understand both ideas here, that you got to kind of get rid of that past. That's, your past is your past. Put it aside. But Rabbi Finkel never put his past aside. His past was the foundation of what he did in the present. He talked about being on the basketball team. He talked about being with girls. He talked about all of these things. So the notion here is, when we talk about the holiness of place, on one hand, that does mean certain specific places have more holiness than others. But it also connotes an opposite idea, that every place you come from has holiness. That's what the Chafetz Chaim said. The place where you come, where you're standing, right? Hashem says to Moshe, the place where you are standing is a Makam Kadosh, is a holy territory. That's very important. So, when I look at a 6-year-old in Mea Sharim, who knows more Gemara than me, and I'll never catch up, yeah, maybe so. But I got stuff from my time in Chicago or California that give me something. And as Hashem needs many types of people. It's a big mistake to think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu only needs one type of Jew. And if I'm not that type of Jew, by definition, I have nothing. No, Hashem needs. Hashem needs the guy from Montana, the guy from California, the guy from Mea Sharim. Each of them brings a piece of divine light into the world. And the picture is incomplete unless we bring all of these pieces in there. In fact, I've said it before, so forgive me if you've heard it. You sometimes notice in the yeshiva world a certain level of what you might call subclinical depression. Meaning it may not be official depression, but a certain lethargy, a certain sadness, a certain lack of enthusiasm for things. Now, what is the source of that? Well, it's complicated. Obviously, there could be many, many sources. But one of the sources is when a person's internal world is being squelched, is being censored. When the message you're getting is all the stuff you liked and all the stuff you did and all the stuff that gave you enthusiasm. That's treif, that's goyish. A Ben Torah doesn't do those things. Now, of course, there are certain things a Ben Torah is not supposed to do. I mean, if you enjoyed, dancing in nightclubs or whatever it would be, you got to, if you were a strip dancer or whatever it would be, certain things you got to stop. Okay, granted. But let's say a person was an artist, a person was a musician, a person liked to write poetry. If the message that you're getting is these are not things a frum person does, in a sense you're amputating part of yourself. And that creates a lot of sadness, that there's part of you that gave you great pleasure and great joy that is not finding its expression. And I think it's axiomatic that if Hashem gave a person talent and interest, he wants that talent and interest to be utilized. Meaning, you can look at it another way. Oh, that's your great test. God made you talented in music, so you will conquer your Yetzer Hara and never play anything. That's one way of looking at it, but I think that's a little perverse. I think the real message is the other way around. Hashem says this is one of the ways you will be serving me.
What if one of the interests is to play handball on Shabbat?
Yeah, so I'm saying, so obviously life is all about balancing, meaning you love to play handball, by all means find a way of doing it, but not necessarily on Shabbat, right? You can't say, my interest is to play on Shabbat. I mean, you want to do it in Shabbat because you're not doing anything else. So like everything else, you never get everything you want, but you try to accommodate a framework in which all of your talents find their expression.
Why does it seem, I think you're touching on this, that it's kind of this kind of vibe in the Yeshivish world and whatever, that Ben Torah does not like engage in the arts and stuff like that. Why does that exist?
Well, I'm going to get into very, very delicate topics here that I'm always afraid, as I say, of the hate mail that I get. Part of it is this. It starts off from a good place, but it may turn into a bad place. The good place is the total emphasis on Torah learning. That once we say Torah learning is the highest possible thing you can do, so we then say everything else is bittul Torah. Now, there's something a little bit wrong, although it's a totally accurate statement, but it's a little bit wrong in terms of the application, because what it's telling a person is, hey, how can you play music? How can you get involved in art? It's taking you away from learning. How can you visit sick people in a hospital? Taking away from learning. How can you help people in a soup kitchen? Taking away from learning. How can you spend time with your wife? Taking away from learning. I get questions. People ask me, newly married guys, how much time do I have to talk to my wife per day? You know, I don't even, that's a good question. I don't even know how to answer that, because anyone that asks the question does not understand what marriage is about. You talk to your wife as long as she needs to talk to you. I mean, that's the answer. And of course, one should know, I'll tell you ahead of time, a very important rule that my wife told me that she heard from someone else, that a wife's attitude towards her husband, this is a really good rule, is give me a half an hour of your time, I'll only need 5 minutes. Give me 5 minutes, I'm going to need a half an hour. Meaning, the dynamic of marriage is, if a wife feels you're there for her, if a wife feels you're available, if a wife feels you're not always looking to the next appointment to get on to something else, she in fact won't need you that much, because she has the security of knowing that you're there for her. On the other hand, when she doesn't have that security, when you're always looking at your watch, or always, you got to go to learn, I got to do this and that, then she'll get anxious and nervous, and kind of things will happen, and she'll need more and more of your time.
And practically that makes a lot of sense, because she might really need you for 30 minutes, like on an occasion, right? She might really need you to be there for her.
Right.
She doesn't need that all the time, but she needs to know that capacity is
That's
there.
right. She needs to know that you are available when it is necessary.
Yes.
And that creates a tremendous amount of security. That when husband and wife are secure in each other, they actually don't need to spend a lot of time with each other. In fact, this is it's a well-known joke, although there are two interpretations. When you walk into a restaurant and you see a man and a woman, men and women sitting at a restaurant, how do you know which one, and assuming there's no children, how do you know which ones are married and which ones are single and dating? So they say, if they're talking to each other, they're dating. If they're not talking to each other, they're married. Now, two interpretations of this, positive and negative. The negative interpretation is, well, when you're dating, you're trying to impress each other, so you talk and like. Once you're married, you take each other for granted, you ignore each other, right? So that's the negative interpretation. But I think there's actually a positive interpretation, and that is, when you're secure with each other, you don't have to fill up the silence with words. You can sit next to each other and not even talk. The wife could be knitting or learning without the husband be doing his thing, and there's a togetherness. It doesn't have to involve. That's why many Gedolim, not all, but many Gedolim were extremely close to their wives. And that's something we need to remember, the shalom bias that existed. But it wasn't the type of closeness in which they were talking to each other hours every day. But it was the closeness of, being secure with each other and knowing that you were there for each other and you were building a home together. And that doesn't require words or talking or the like. So silence, you can see this. I mean, maybe you have grandparents like that or whatever, in which, they just, they sit with each other, and, that's good. Rav Chaim Kanievsky probably didn't talk to his wife, 5 minutes in a day, although I can't say that for sure. But when his wife was hospitalized, he went to the hospital and said, you have to come back. I just can't learn the same way when you're not in the house. I need to feel your presence in the house for me to be able to function well. So that didn't mean some conscious communication, but just the sense of having that presence there made a big difference. Yeah.
So, can we go back to Jerusalem just for a second in place? If Jerusalem is a better conduit for holiness.
Yeah.
Personally, when I leave Jerusalem and then when I leave Israel and go back anywhere out, there's almost a feeling of lack. It's very difficult. So,
yes.
What do you think the explanation is behind that occurrence?
When you leave Jerusalem, you think?
When I leave Israel.
Leave Israel.
Yeah.
Well, once again, in a way that's quite natural. And indeed, it's proper that you feel this way. And that is, here you were in an environment where your soul was attuned to receive godliness in a very open way. And when you leave, there are veils of concealment in which you don't feel that same thing. You see, so it's very. In fact, the way, even geographically, it's this way. You know, Yerushalayim is on hills, right? So when you're coming, let's say, from Tel Aviv, from the airport to Yerushalayim, you know, you see, you're going up the mountain of God, right? Even visually, spatially, there is this sense that you're entering. And then the greeting that greets you, Baruchim Habaim. Now, Baruchim Habaim is just modern Hebrew for welcome. But if you read it literally, Baruchim Habaim, those who come are blessed. So what do you think, right? Yerushalayim is kind of saying, welcome those of you who are blessed to enter the holy city. So the question becomes, so you leave Israel, you leave Jerusalem, how do you hold on to it? So this is where Shabbos comes in. This is the very important point, because I actually got sidetracked. Yerushalayim, Eretz Yisrael, Mishkan, Beis HaMikdash represent holiness of space. But Shabbos represents the holiness of time. And the very fact that Shabbos overrides Mishkan, meaning to say you don't build a Mishkan on Shabbos, tells us that holiness of time is of a greater magnitude than holiness of space. And the reason is, holiness of space is by definition limited to space, to a particular space. Holiness of time can be anywhere. So in a sense, one way that can help you over the deflated sadness of leaving Israel is that every single Shabbos, it's as if you can re-experience the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim via the holiness of time, even though you don't have the holiness of space. And that's why it's very important. I mean, Shabbos is important here too, obviously. But especially in Chutz La'aretz, Shabbos is going to be your great connection. That's going to be the time in which you are kind of transported back to this land and to this city and to this wall. And you're experiencing that sense of closeness to Hashem. So Shabbos is much more than the negatives of not doing stuff. Right? Can't turn on a light, can't rip toilet paper. Okay, we have many laws we have to comply with. But the purpose of those laws is to foster a certain appreciation, a certain environment. Okay? So it's not enough, if a person were to knock himself out and just sleep for 27 hours of Shabbos. So I guess he could pride himself, I did not do a single malacha on Shabbos. That's great. But what type of Shabbos is that, right? Shabbos has to be the day of encounter with God. Right? So that's why I think Shabbos will help you over this. And of course, even during the week, we have tefillin, we have davening, we have Torah learning. You try to have chaverim, friends, either direct face-to-face or by Zoom or telephone. I hope, I'm not sure if I'm talking to anyone, that I guess some of you might be going to Chutz La'aretz for the Chagim, for Pesach. Some of you, I don't know, might be leaving for good after this point, I don't know. But either way, you got to hold on to this holiness and take it even into the mundane life. And the holiness of time is even greater than the holiness of space. So what you can get from Shabbos might even be greater than what you can get from Yerushalayim and the base Hamikdash.
Just a quick add-on is like, do you just want to hold on, or do you want to grow with it? You just want to.
Well, when I say hold on, I don't mean just stagnate and remain the same, but hold on as an energy source, meaning you're like a battery that needs to be recharged and refilled. So by holding on to that holiness, your soul constantly gets recharged and revived by that encounter with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, and once again, remember the Chafetz Chaim's words. The place where you stand is holy. Wherever you are, God can be found. God is not only here, God is there too. It's easier to feel God here, so we have to remember that and use Shabbos and the like. But the Metzius is, the fact of the matter is, God is there as well. Yeah.
So I understand that Shabbos, the Kedusha of Shabbos, since it's bound by time and not by space, is more accessible than the Kedusha of Yerushalayim.
Yeah.
But what makes it so that the quality of the Kedusha itself is more than the Yerushalayim? Just because it's more accessible, why not make it the quality itself better?
Well, the problem is, since God is everywhere, the only meaning of greater quality or lesser quality is accessibility. That's the very definition of the term. Kedusha is of a higher quality when it is more available for me. That's exactly the definition. And therefore we can talk about Shabbos being that way. Yeah.
About what we discussed previously, what the point of high priority of learning Torah for Baalei Tshuva. Maybe the Rav can recommend a way to view it, like the way to view it, but life as well. The Rav mentioned that either it's a wife or hobbies or work. So suddenly discovering all this huge content, what is a healthy way to look at it in terms of to balance all the aspects?
Well, listen, there's no question that learning Torah has to be a very, very important part of my life, and a major part of my life, to the degree that it is possible. But I think you do need to balance it with family, for example. I mean, shalom bayis, spending time with your children, and even the interest that you indulge in. Because once again, if you are, censoring yourself, if you're amputating parts of yourself, that's going to cause misery. And when there's misery or depression, the words of God do not penetrate your soul and do not elevate you. So you have to find some way of integrating all of these different, all of these different components. But the precise mix, it's hard to say. It would differ on each individual's part. Let me just mention one final point. And this is a little bit of an anomaly. On one hand, we don't build the Mishkan on Shabbos. No, we don't build it. The 39 malachos that we don't do on Shabbos are based on the construction of the Mishkan. On the other hand, there's a lot of Shabbos desecration activity that does go on in the Beis HaMikdash. If you were to go into the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos, you would be amazed at how much Chilul Shabbos is going on. They slaughtered the animals for the daily offerings and the Musaf offerings. They made fires. They burnt the meat. They lit the menorah. They burnt incense. In other words, there is a general rule that the surface of the temple does override Shabbos. So one might ask the question, isn't there a little bit of an anomaly here? That on one hand, you don't build a Mishkan on Shabbos, but the activities of the Mishkan do override Shabbos. They do override Shabbos. And here, there's an important musar that Hashem is telling us. And that is, what you do in a building is a lot more important than the fanciness of the building itself. Meaning like this. People often want to give money to a yeshiva for a new building, like we have a new base medrash. People are less willing to give money for salaries, operating budgets, because they like to see beautiful buildings come up. But the lesson of Mishkan is that, yeah, the Mishkan is a beautiful building, but its construction is not important enough to override Shabbos. But the activities that go on in the Mishkan, they are what God really cares about. It's not the building. It's the activities. Same thing with the yeshiva. It's not the building that matters. It's the learning, the devotion, the mitzvos, the chesed. So even if, in an ideal world, even if you were sitting outside in the rain and you were sharing a Gemara, you didn't even have your own Gemara. You're learning with devotion. That is what God cherishes. And therefore, the halachic dichotomy between construction of the Mishkan and the avoda in the Mishkan suggests this idea: focus on activity, don't focus on buildings. It's interesting, in the Yerushalmi Maseches Shkalim, there's an interesting machlokas about this, almost, where two rabbis were walking by, and one of them, they passed a magnificent shul. So one person said, "Look at the beautiful shul that my grandfather's money built. My grandfather built this beautiful shul." And the other rabbi said, "Look at how many great scholars starved because all this money went into the building." Now again, there's a machlokas here, meaning both points are valid. To have a beautiful building is glory to Hashem. You're supposed to do mitzvahs in a beautiful way. At the same time, it also means certain other needs are not being met. Poverty and the like. And therefore, there's kind of a machlokas. Should we emphasize the buildings? Should we emphasize the people? One person said, "Oh, the building is so magnificent. It's glory to Hashem." The other said, "What about the people that could have been helped?" So it is an issue. I mean, I'll give you another example. And this is not halacha l'maisa. But very, very often, and I see it more and more, when someone dies and the family wants to memorialize the person, so one of the ways they commonly memorialize a person is they commission the writing of a Sefer Torah in that person's memory. A Sefer Torah costs around $25,000, and they, hire a sofer to write a Sefer Torah. Now that's good. I mean, that's a mitzvah, etc., etc. But the question becomes, we don't necessarily have a shortage of Sefer Torah today. I mean, most shuls already have a Sefer Torah and the like. And if you were to take the $25,000, instead of giving it to write another Sefer Torah, you would give it to a yeshiva or a kollel that would support poor families. That might be a better use of money. Now I understand the sofer himself may be poor, and therefore maybe they're stuck to help the sofer. That might be so. But just in terms of a memorial activity, we're sometimes so focused on tangible things, whether they be buildings or whether they be Sifrei Torah, or even monuments. A fancy monument for a grave. Monuments cost money. And the Chavetz Chaim would tell people, instead of putting money into a fancy monument to honor your grandfather, give the money to tzedakah, which in Shemayim will be a much greater zechus. Right? Even though there's not going to be any physical memorial, but that's a bigger zechus, right? So this causes us to think about what our priorities should be. Okay, be well.